I'm back today talking again about the Second Amendment and why you need to always put your best foot forward when discussing the right to bear arms with people who are hostile. And when I say hostile, I mean that there are people who seriously believe that if we put more laws into place, we're going to get better results. And by better results, they mean that people will suddenly lose their desire to murder others because they can't legally acquire firearms, and they'll just give up because they won't seek out any other means, right? It's not as if people get poisoned. It's not as if people get killed with blunt objects, and it's not as if people use explosive devices in order to commit murder, right? Wrong. But at the same time, we have to deal with the issue of the gun crime that does exist, right? So these are issues that, if you're familiar with the argument about the Second Amendment and whether it is sacrosanct or not, you can look at the previous video, episode 1. In this video, we're going to talk about whether, in reality, the number of people killed with firearms is driven by the laws, or by rather maybe some other factors. So the reason I'm turning to this topic again, the first video was largely because of a conversation I had with a woman who was over our house. We had lunch together about a week and a half ago. Nice lady, but a convinced liberal, political liberal, very committed and not just somebody who is, just watching the news and voting accordingly, but actually, I would say, beyond that, a real person who does actively participate in many of these causes. But to her credit, she did hear us out on the issue, and in fact, it was a very amusing conversation from both standpoints. But I think that you can't just browbeat people and force them to agree with your side, because then you actually, by creating more stress and more aggression, you cause people to take a harder stance on it. And that's not what I wanted to do at the time. It's also not what I want to do with these videos. So I always urge people, when you're talking about the Second Amendment, when you're talking about any issue, don't always go with your head charging in if you have somebody who's open-minded. Obviously, if you have somebody who's very hard-headed and isn't even going to give you the time of day, this isn't what I'm talking about. But you need to understand that many people, they're conditioned to think a certain way because of the limited amount of media that they consume from a very specific group of sources, and it's just not going to work unless you really try to use the real data that's out there and the real situation that's out there, and bring in questions that challenge their point of view. And if you see this happening to yourself, somebody else using this on you, then you have to recognize this is a person who is not just trying to hoodwink you. They are engaged in a real conversation. So it works the other way. If somebody were to come up with me and say, look, there are real problems with the Second Amendment, with the way that it allows criminals to get away with things, and I would still have to listen to their argument before I could decide whether it was a valid argument or not. So anyway, getting into it, whereas the previous video was more about the ways that infringing on the Second Amendment would infringe on other rights within the Constitution, it's unavoidable. This one would be more about how existing firearms laws are actually not contributing to a safer society. And the reason that I went for this video specifically, not just the series, because recently I've had to travel a lot to Michigan. And while Michigan's a beautiful state, they have an awful football team, but they're a beautiful state. I would say that I've learned a little bit about how it's more restrictive in terms of gun control than Ohio, which is where I live. And I have to say that I wanted to see whether it leads to a better yield on results. And better yield, it doesn't mean that I dismiss any killing or murder committed with a firearm as being expendable, but we do want less people to be murdered. The question is whether more gun control laws will lead to that. Again, it isn't a question of which goal we want, because I don't think that anyone is here asking for there to be more deaths from firearms, except maybe people on the news who revel in some of the more lurid and bloody aspects of the news cycle, as you've seen from their coverage of various disasters and things like that, wildfires, and of course mass shootings. So to review, I do want to go through some of the differences in the gun laws between Ohio and Michigan. Now, I'm used to not saying the word gun because it actually hurts my videos on YouTube, but because I'm urging you to follow me instead on BitChute, Rumble, and Odyssey, the three other video hosting platforms that I've been generally using, I don't care anymore. Don't watch me on YouTube if you can. Watch me on one of the other three, and we can talk about it there. Unfortunately, I don't see a path forward on YouTube. Alt tech is the way to go, and we are seeing more and more that people with dissenting opinions are not respected on mainstream platforms. So in Ohio, I can enlarge this 1 second. It actually is pretty free over here. You do need a gun carry permit for a handgun, but not for a long gun. You do need you do not need a purchase permit, meaning that if I purchase a firearm, I don't need a permit to get it. You need you don't need registration of a firearm, which is very important. And you are allowed to open carry. It does sort of depend on where you're going, though, because if you go into some of these, it says, of course, liquor establishments, bars, and other entertainment venues, they might say, no, I mean, we don't want this type of provocation here. Background checks on private gun sales required? No. Magazine size restriction? Also, no restriction on that. If you go to Michigan, there's a couple differences, okay? Scrolling up, you have Michigan, they do require registration of a handgun. Isn't that a little odd that in a country where they talk mostly about assault rifles, they require registration of handguns, which are generally the type of weapon that most gun control advocates say, well, we'll never take away your pistol, we'll never take away your revolver, we'll never take away your Glock, we'll never take away your Smith & Wesson, we'll never take... So the bottom line here is that they have decided, oh, we're going to require you to register a handgun, but not a long gun. Open carry is allowed, yes. And background checks on private gun sales are required, yes. For handguns, though, not for assault rifles. Isn't that a little interesting, right? And we're also going to go to Illinois. Those are the three states we're going to talk about today. Illinois requires a permit, requires a purchase permit, right? So if you're buying, whether it is a handgun or a long gun, you're required to get a permit to purchase it. This is something that is not a requirement anywhere else in the Midwest. Registration of firearm, no. Open carry allowed, no. So you're not allowed to open carry in Illinois. Okay, so bear this in mind. You have more restrictions in Illinois than in Michigan and Ohio. But will that lead to fewer gun deaths? That's the real question here. Which set of laws leads to fewer gun deaths? Are background checks on private gun sales required? Yes, for both handguns and long guns. The seller is required to verify the purchaser's FOID card. Magazine size restriction, no. So that's the one area where they don't have the big restriction. Okay, so this is from gunstocarry.com. It's a very well-known website that is used in order to look at the difference between different state laws. So if you go right over the border from Illinois to Indiana, there's a lot of these laws are actually eliminated. If you go to Iowa, this is something that has actually changed. You won't even need a carry permit, right? If you go to Kansas, you don't need any of it. So my question is, where do these gun laws have the most impact? And let's go to the statistics as I've laid them out here. In Michigan, this is statistics since 2014, and that's all from the Trace. Okay? The Trace is actually a pretty heavily pro-gun control website, and they log all of the different shooting incidents in the country by, I believe it's by zip code, and they collate it into this massive database and a map, and they lay it out, right? So that you can see the impact of gun violence in the country. Except when you really start to look at it, the variable that seems to matter, in my opinion, has nothing to do with whether the laws are stronger or not. So in Michigan, remember, Michigan has stronger controls on handguns than Ohio. And yet, Detroit, which has 7% of the population of Michigan, actually has 41% of the gun fatalities. So imagine that. A part of the state that's only home to 7% of the people is also home to almost 42% of the gun fatalities. Almost half is within not the county where Detroit is, Wayne County. I checked that. I couldn't narrow it because I wanted to do it by county as well. But the city of Detroit, so almost 42% of the gun fatalities, almost 47% of the gun injuries, and almost 45% of the total shootings. Grand Rapids, which is the second largest the second largest municipality in Michigan, how much did they have? They're only 1.87% of the population. Grand Rapids has only 3% of the gun fatalities in that period since 2014, only 6.3% of the gun injuries, and only 5.44% of the total shootings. So it is not even proportional to the number of people living there. It just is that Detroit has a larger gun crime problem, right? Now, do you want to draw conclusions as to why? Because I don't think that you can. I looked and I checked, and Detroit has no different gun control measures than does the rest of the state of Michigan. Okay? So bear that in mind. There is no way that gun crime is influenced within a state, like Michigan at least, by gun laws. Okay? You look at Ohio, and the picture is a little bit different. So Cleveland, you have 19.9% of the gun fatalities in a city that's 3.36% of the population. So I'm going to use this as an example. It's not also just because there's more people, because as a unit, Cleveland actually has a smaller population than Columbus, which is the capital city. Now, I also think it might be a result of density. Cleveland is a little more compact by area than Columbus. Columbus seems to be much wider, but you still have to sort of wonder why it is that Cleveland has higher gun crime than Columbus, even though it has fewer people. It has 20% of the injuries and 19.78% of the total shooting. So roughly 20% is in Cleveland. We have three major cities in Ohio, meaning that a major city I would consider above 250,000 residents. Michigan only has one. That would be Detroit. So I just included Grand Rapids because I wanted to compare it to any city. Grand Rapids is the second largest city. If you look at Columbus, it goes down, even though it has as much as twice the population of Cleveland if you just look at boundaries. Columbus has 17.45% of the fatalities, 17.41% of the injuries, and 17.45% of the total incidents, even though it has 6.66% of the population of Ohio. If you look at Cincinnati, which is the third city in Ohio, it has 11% of the fatalities, 13% of the injuries, and almost 13% of the total shooting incidents. So it's not even proportional in a sense to the number of people in the area. Now, I do believe that Cleveland might have, let me see here. You do have some extra gun laws in Cleveland. A total revamp of Cleveland's gun laws is heading to the mayor's desk for signatures. This is from 2015. City Council approved the overhaul Monday night. Mayor Frank Jackson's administration introduced the ordinance months ago. The law will require convicted gun offenders to register and address with the city. Private gun sales and lost or stolen guns need to be reported too. So those are extra things that are not within the Ohio gun laws. If I thought for one moment that this piece of legislation would somehow have anyway, they're going to talk about it. But those were this is one of the funniest things. It's that they think that they're going to be able to actually enforce this, when in reality, most of the places where you buy a firearm in this area, in northeastern Ohio, are not in the city of Cleveland. They're in some of the suburbs, right? So people could just go buy the firearm and go back to their district, go back to where they live within the city, and just ignore it. You know, they don't have to, because it's the city of, it's a different city. That city is not enforcing the Cleveland gun law. So having your municipality enforce more gun laws is not really effective anyway. So therefore, Cleveland, despite these higher gun laws, is above 19.9. It's above 20%. It's about hovering at 20%, whether it's fatalities, injuries, or total incidents. And it leads the state in terms of all of these, even though we have a smaller population than Columbus. So take that for what you will. The final statistical area that I want to talk about is Illinois. So the state of Illinois has about 5,800 gun fatalities since 2014, 22,000 injuries, or almost 23,000, and 23,000 total incidents. So you understand why that could be. If there's an incident, there could be no people wounded. There could be several people wounded. There could be several people killed. There could be one person killed, everyone else wounded. It could work in several different ways. So Chicago has 67% of the fatalities, 82% of the injuries, and 79% of the total incidents, while it has 21% of the population of Illinois. Now, recognize that if you look at the populations of Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, they're not that far away. Illinois is only about 1 million people stronger than Ohio. It's probably actually gone down. They're probably much closer now. Both states have lost residents, but Illinois is really losing residents because property tax in Illinois is insane. Property tax, sales tax, everything is taxed in Illinois. It's one of the toughest states to live in, and I know people who have moved away because they just can't afford it anymore. They move to Indiana. They move to Iowa. They even move to states that are much poorer than Illinois because it's just unaffordable at this point. And I really have to say that if you live in Chicago and you have to deal with this, I don't know exactly what you're waiting for, because it doesn't seem like it's a very manageable situation. You have gun crime that is much higher than in any other of the areas that we're talking about. It's about 3 times as high as in Detroit. Now, remember, some of these cities, you do see higher gun crime, but the population is much higher. People could say that Chicago has a population that is, in this case, almost 4 times the size of Detroit's. And that might be why it has 3 times the amount of gun crime. But it's not only because of that. There are districts in Chicago that are more strictly policed because, let's put it this way, the community living there wants more police because they're richer. And there's parts of Chicago where the police are almost entirely absent because the people there don't really want to cooperate with the police. It's as simple as that. I'm not going to get further into that. That's not really the topic of today. But it is a bigger driving force into whether there is more gun crime or not. If you have a place in Chicago where people are shot and then nobody actually reports who they saw do it or anything like that. You could just put Chicago murder, no witnesses, and you can see what it pulls up. Wow. This isn't the story I was expecting. So this guy tried to murder a bunch of people with a pickup truck. Even when Chicago police solve a murder, justice is not always served. And this is about a woman whose son was murdered, Nicola Moni. And he was murdered around 7 a.m. in 2017. And Chicago police identified the man who killed Malumba's son, one of the rare cases solved by CPD. But the alleged killer was never charged with the crime. According to WBEZ analysis of Cook County State's Attorney data, Nicola Moni's death is one of hundreds of cases that were solved by Chicago police detectives but never charged in court. Just a week and a half after her son's murder, Malumba said a detective called her down to the police station and played a video for her that he said showed the moments leading up to her son's death, but the blame soon turned to her son. Malumba said while the video played, the detective pointed at the screen and said her son had a gun in a park near their home. He said Nicola Moni and another person exchanged gunfire, but no one was hit. Then, Malumba said, the video showed another man come out of a nearby apartment building and take off running after Nicola Moni. Nicola Moni was killed about 5 blocks away. News reports from the day of the shooting quote neighbors describing Nicola Moni being chased from behind and shot in the head. A police source said detectives presented the case to prosecutors who declined to file charges, citing the fact that the suspect claimed self-defense and there were no witnesses to contradict him. Tondra Simonton, Chief Communications Officer for Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox, said they reviewed the case and concluded that based on the evidence and the law, we could not meet our burden of proof to file criminal charges. Malumba said she didn't see her son shoot a gun on the video, but even if he did, he should have been arrested and punished for it, not killed. So anyway, make of that what you will. The police did solve the killing, but if the killing was self-defense and neither of the now the question is, was the person who committed the killing of the son, did he own the firearm legally? That's the real question. But there is no, the prosecutor declined to prosecute. They're talking about self-defense. They're talking about all this other stuff where he ran away and yada, yada, yada. This is why prosecuting gun crime is often more complicated than the people who are in favor of more gun control will admit, because they've never actually had to be involved in any of these legal situations. So that's as far as that's concerned. You do have some shootings that happen in rural areas. This happened in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it was an officer-involved shooting. And it happened in January 2019. But the person who was killed, his name was Dean Bruning, and he was a white guy. So that didn't really make the news because that is not really a cause that people are going to rally around. A person who got into a fight with the police and got killed, but who is not of a certain race, that doesn't fit the profile of a cause poster boy, right? Another thing that gun control advocates need to consider, and they're going to have to actually answer one day for how they intend to deal with this. Latino gun ownership rises amid uncertainty and fears of unrest in the U.S. So this is from last year. It was from before the election. It's from June 25th, or sorry, March 25th. So it was even, or actually no, this is much more recent. It says here it's from March 25th, 2021. Ahead of the 2020 election, a survey from Pew Research found that nearly 7 in 10 Hispanic voters believe there should be stricter gun laws in the U.S., while 24% said gun laws are adequate. So that's what the survey said. The poll found a sharp divide between Latino Democrats and Republicans, however, with 80% of Hispanic Democrats being in favor of stricter gun laws compared to 42% of Hispanic Republicans. A separate poll conducted by Latino Decisions in late 2019 found that 8 in 10 Latinos in Texas alone were in favor of stricter gun laws, with 59% saying that gun laws were critical to how they would vote in the presidential election. But they didn't say whether the question didn't ask whether they wanted the stricter gun laws. It said that it was critical to how they would vote. Some Latinos, however, reported that interest in guns among members of the community have increased as a result of concerns over racism and unrest in cities across the U.S. Rafael Cedillo, the owner and instructor of a firearm safety business in El Paso, directly across the border from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, said that demand began to rise after a deadly 2019 shooting that left 23 people dead at a Walmart in the city. An investigation found that the shooter held racist and anti-immigrant views. It's sad, but my business really booms after a tragic incident, like a shooting, he said in an interview with LPO. After the one in El Paso, my home, I couldn't fit everyone into my schedule. So that's a very common thing. This is something that after an incident, especially an incident involving a certain specific demographic group, there's a spike in gun purchases among members of that group. So that happened after this incident in El Paso, the El Paso shooting. That also happened, by the way, after the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2015 in Orlando. A lot of gay people started to buy weapons. While before the El Paso incident, Cedillo said that his firearms classes averaged between 7 and 10 people per class. After the shooting, they averaged more than 30, more than half of whom were Latinos. I get a lot of people wanting to learn how to shoot just to be able to defend themselves. Yeah, people who have never owned guns are actually now buying them for protection. Cedillo's comments were echoed by P.B. Gomez, a fourth-generation Mexican-American who in April 2020 founded the Latino Rifle Association. What made me think of a Latino gun rights group was the El Paso shooting. This horrific terrorist act really shook the Latino community. He said, I knew Latinos were really going to start exploring the prospect of gun ownership for self-defense. Now, notice that for no reason at all up to now, they put a photo of Beto O'Rourke into this article. Now, Beto O'Rourke, he's the former mayor. I think he's a former congressman from El Paso. He's a former city councilman. But there really is no other reason to put him into the article. I mean, there's no mention of him up until now, right? I don't even see any mention of him, right? So they're just putting a photo of Beto O'Rourke. And that's it. That's the relevance to the topic. Why? Because what people don't know is that Beto O'Rourke is the person who was running for president, vowed that he would, hell yes, we're going for your AR-15. And where is he today? He's nowhere. Yes, the government does want to take away assault weapons, but curiously, I want to ask people. Okay, and I want an answer to this. If assault rifles are really the big key factor in gun crime, then why is it that you see actually handguns being the ones that require a permit in states like Michigan and other states in that area. I think even in Indiana, because in most incidents where somebody is murdered or somebody is assaulted with a firearm, they don't use a long gun. They don't use a rifle or assault rifle or any other sort of long gun. They use a handgun because it's much more easy to conceal, and you could probably dispose of it much quicker, right? If you're planning to murder someone, what's more easy to get rid of? Something that is 6 inches long or something that is 2 feet long? I think it's pretty easy to determine which one is the more stealthy weapon. Interest grew further, Gomez added, as a result of the unrest that swept across the United States ahead of the 2020 election as a result of political and racial tensions. What made me finally decide that it was time for something like the LRA was the unrest that dominated the country in the beginning of 2020, especially seeing far-right groups storm the Michigan State House, he said. Rates of first-time gun buyers are skyrocketing, and I want there to be some guidance for the Latino community. So the answer to some of these incidents, which, by the way, so they stormed the Michigan State House. There was no fatality whatsoever in the incident. But the people who are watching this and worried by them, they're not saying, oh, I want to have less guns on the street. They're saying, I want to be armed myself because I think that if something were to happen, I can't trust authorities to be on my side. One of the reasons for that is because people who are Latino and people who are black are being taught that they can't rely on the police or on law enforcement to protect them. In my opinion, they shouldn't rely on the police to protect them. They should rely on themselves. One of the reasons that they can rely on themselves if they want to is because we do have a Second Amendment. And my firm belief as a lowercase L libertarian is that if you are somebody, a private citizen, you should be allowed to buy the firearm of your choice and protect yourself, regardless of whether you are male or female, regardless of whether you are Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or whatever, or Mexican or Asian or black or white or whatever. I don't care. It is your choice. You should do it responsibly. You should adhere to the laws of your district because you don't want to be a cause. You don't want to be sort of the martyr for a cause that can be solved without the sort of confrontation that many of these people who are, they're very exhibitionist about their gun ownership. Just do what's sensible. And what's sensible is what's legal at the moment, and you should act to make what's legal what's actually even more sensible, right? You should act in order to loosen some of these restrictions, in order to make it easier for people to safely and legally carry their firearms and not have to fear harassment by federal officials and bureaucrats. So that's my position. I don't believe people should buy illegal weapons. But guess what? Most of the crimes committed in the United States are committed with illegal weapons. Before we get to that, though, additionally, Gomez said the recent surge in Latino gun buyers forms part of a wider wave of members of, quote, marginalized groups seeking protection. There was an explosion of first-time buyers through 2020, led by black people and women. I experienced this myself. My usual gun shop in Sacramento began looking a lot more diverse. He said, I think this recent civil unrest is making people feel as though the government either can't or won't protect them. Notably, this rising number of Latino gun owners do not identify solely as Republicans, who statistically are much more likely to be gun owners. Gomez's LRA, for example, identifies as progressive, anti-racist, and even anti-capitalist, he said. The big gun groups in the usual places where one learns about guns are dominated by white conservatives, and it can feel unfriendly if you're not that, he said. There is value in offering specifically to Latinos while still remaining firmly opposed to hostile right-wing attitudes. So this is something that I find ironic. Okay, now I'm 100% in favor of this guy forming whatever group he wants. He can associate with whoever he wants. But I challenge you. I've been to gun stores throughout the state and also in other states and recently in Michigan. And you go to any gun store And there are plenty of people who are not white. In fact, many of them are black. You do see Hispanic people, especially at the gun shows, you see a lot of Hispanic people. And nobody's telling them to leave, because the fact is that if you are selling guns, you don't want to throw away any of your market. The only people you don't want buying your guns are people who will get you in trouble because they're not allowed to own one. So that's why you don't turn away customers, and you want to put the right firearm in the hand of the right person. And the right person is not a person who's not supposed to have it because of legal reasons, right? They might have a felony, or they might have other reason that they're precluded from buying a firearm. But this idea that they don't want people of a certain race coming to patronize them, just go. This is something I recommend. If you are one of these people who opposes the Second Amendment, who wants to impose more gun control in this country, or who wants more gun laws because you think it's going to be safer, and you think that it's harder for minorities because there's racism in the gun owner community, I challenge you to go to your closest gun shop and just, browse and look at the other people who are coming in. Don't be too obvious, because you will probably attract your attention too. You shouldn't just chat people up. It is not like, would you chat people up at the grocery store? I hope not. I don't like to be chatted up at the grocery store. But yeah, maybe chat with the owner. But you will see that the people who come into the gun store, both for buying supplies, whether it's ammunition or cleaning products, or for buying their next firearm, are usually people of very diverse backgrounds, because people of diverse backgrounds are gun owners, right? The statistics may not reflect it, but the statistics should reflect it in the area where you live in. If you live in a state that is very diverse racially, you're going to have a lot of gun owners that come from different backgrounds, okay? So the legal gun issue is something that needs to be brought to bear. People say, well, all these firearms, they shouldn't be sold legally. We need to be able to control this because it's out of control. There's too many of these deaths, and these gun manufacturers are getting off scot-free, and these gun vendors are getting off scot-free, and all these other people, they're not being held accountable. It's bunk, because the percent of all state and federal prisoners who had possessed or used a firearm during their offense in 2016, it says here. So it is more than 15% possessed a handgun. Now, it also says less than 5%, and I think it says here only like 2%, were purchased legally. Okay, here's the highlights so this is from, by the way, the Justice Department. Okay, this is from 2019, the Office of Justice Programs, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It says about 21% of state and 20% of federal prisoners said they possessed a gun during their offense, while 79% of state and 80% of federal prisoners did not. So that just is people who possessed a gun during their offense. It doesn't mean that they used it. All right, 79% and 80%, 79% of state and 80% of federal prisoners didn't possess one. So you're still going to have a lot of this crime happening. About 29% of state and 36% of federal prisoners serving time for a violent offense possessed a gun during the offense. So it's not even a majority of people who committed a violent offense possessing a gun. About 1.3% of prisoners obtained a gun from a retail source and used it during their offense. So think about it that way. 1.3% of prisoners. So you're trying to address only 1.3% of the gun crime. It says handguns. Handguns were the most common type of firearm possessed by state and federal prisoners. 18% in both cases. 11% of all prisoners used a handgun. So that means that they discharged the handgun while in the act. Among prisoners who possessed a gun during their offense, 90% did not obtain it from a retail source. Among prisoners who possessed a firearm during their offense, 0.8% obtained it at a gun show. So people who talk about the gun show loophole, that accounts for only 0.8% of current federal and state prisoners serving time for a gun crime. And that's just so think about the larger population, how small it is. But even just the people who possessed a firearm during a crime, only 0.8% obtain it at a gun show. So that's less than 1 in 100. About 1 in 5 state and federal prisoners who possessed a firearm during their offense obtained it with the intent to use it during the crime. So the majority of the people who buy a firearm, even if it was not legally obtained, say that they intended to use it for a crime when they bought it. Among state prisoners who possessed a gun during their offense, 27% killed someone with it, another 12% injured someone, 7% fired the gun but did not injure anyone, and 54% did not fire it. So possessing a weapon does not necessarily mean that you've committed a crime with the weapon. That's something that should be... Now, there is illegal possession. That's a different crime. So you are committing a crime by illegally possessing a weapon. But it's not as if all of these murders are being committed and it's only people who have firearms who are doing it, right? State prisoners with no military service were more likely to possess a gun during their offense than prisoners who had served in the military. So that's an interesting statistic, but not really to our point. So finally, I will say that, I don't want this to be a video that only serves to browbeat people. I said this at the beginning, I'm going to say at the end. If you're a person who opposes the right to keep and bear arms, I want you to understand, you are actually not going to, if you get any of these laws passed, which I hope is not true, it's not going to happen. I hope that you're unsuccessful in it, for my sake, for your sake. But if you do, you will not actually be helping helping communities to control gun crime. And if anything, you're going to be taking legal gun owners, putting them within a category where they will be a criminal unless they turn in their weapons. Many of them will not turn in their weapons. You will see more people imprisoned for possession as opposed to imprisoned for committing an act with the weapon. Because even today, with the restrictions as loose as you claim them to be, I don't feel that they're loose, but they are loose according to you. The majority of the crimes where a person is in possession of a firearm, they haven't actually fired the weapon. So think about that for a second. It is not the device that is malicious. It's the person behind it that has the evil intent. That's about it for today. I want to remind you, please subscribe to the newsletter in the description. Also subscribe to me on BitChute, Rumble, Odyssey for all the videos. You can find me on Gab and Minds if you want to just post or tag me or whatever, or I think there's messaging on both of them. You can also support me on Subscribestar. I am embracing alt tech. I think you should embrace alt tech, but I think you should also embrace the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution, including the Second Amendment. And I hope you have a good conversation. You can always put your comments in my comment feed, and I'll try to respond. Talk to you later.